Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Just over 20 years ago, NSA released guides to securing Windows 2000 and IIS. But 10 years ago, NSA also started hacking Windows left and right with Eternal Blue, keeping that one hush-hush. Then 5 years ago, Eternal Blue was finally leaked and Microsoft patched it. Now, 3 years ago, NSA released their software reverse engineering tool, Ghidra. And about 3 months ago, they had to patch it for Log4j. Everybody's got to patch something sometime, which means this week we talk with Levin Chang about adding observability to APIs to make monitoring them more effective and to use that monitoring to make them more secure. In the news segment, Markdown meets integer overflows and local files. A logic flaw goes and instead of or. A new census of open source software apps, inside iCloud's private relay, cloud pen testing tools, and more. Coordinate your disclosures and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly, and I just got lost in my notes here because this is actually episode 187, recorded March 7th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I haven't forgotten, though, that I'm here with Mr. John Kinsella. Hello, John.
I'm not sure what you're talking about. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I never left.
That's true. You're always here in our hearts. You know what else is here in our hearts? If you don't want to miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content, you can always visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to, of course, subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone or whatever that device is. You can also join our mailing list, talk with us live on Discord, come say hi, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. You can also join us March 10th for our next Security Weekly Unlocked webcast for an intro into KQL queries. To register, visit securityweekly.com/webcasts. And of course, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And now that we're all discombobulated, because that's a really fun word to say out loud, we're going to do the news segment first, John. And before we dive into the super AppSec news, I did want to note that International Women's Day is tomorrow, March 8th, 2022. And here's a challenge for our audience, especially men in the audience, that if you think of women in InfoSec and the first two names are the only two names that you can bring to mind are Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper, maybe it's time to look a bit more broadly to see all the women out there currently doing awesome stuff. I'll just say real quick, there's Katie Masouras, been around for quite a while doing cool stuff in the bug bounty, full disclosure area. Julia Evans, who's had some great zines about all kinds of Linux command line tools and other protocols that have been great to read, and Azaria Labs, great ARM reverse engineering and hacking. So a couple great resources there. And one other person I wanted to mention too, Chris Kubeka at Sec Evangelism on Twitter. She has been in Ukraine, out of Ukraine, and also helping a lot of students, a lot of others try to get out of Ukraine, get out safely. So I think that is someone who is part of AppSec, but who's put human security and real-world security to the forefront. So I want to make sure to give them all a great shout-out. And now we'll take a big moment to catch my breath as I whirlwind through that and say, John, there's also all kinds of news for us to catch up on. A couple of things, of course. I introduced us with all kinds of patching, and it looks like we have to patch Firefox. So two more bugs out there, huh?
Yeah. And sorry for not taking your lead on that. There's I was trying to think of names of people off the top of my head that I want to actually give a shout out to, and I'm horrible with names, so I don't have any. But
we'll do it throughout the entire month. We can drop into Discord as well. So let's
I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's do it the month or not longer. These are things that we talk about a lot on the show. It's something that's very near and dear to our heart. So appreciate you bringing it up, and hope everyone's sort of, both men and women and everyone else of any sexuality or identification, really embrace this and sort of let's make our whole community more diverse. Firefox has, as you asked me, 2 new vulnerabilities, if I find that new tab. And so, yeah, they're both, I don't know if it's purposeful or not, whoever found these. Not sure if they were found by the same person, I don't think so. But they're both use after free with exploits, which are apparently actively being exploited. So if you haven't got that prompt yet to restart Firefox, you want to. I got it on one of my machines, but the other ones I didn't, so I had to go and do it manually. Anyways, so one is I always have to see it in front of me, XSLT.
Yes.
Talk about tongue twisters. So this is used for doing basically XML transforms as well as for generating PDFs. Someone has figured out that there's a way of, if you remove a parameter while it's being parsed, so that sounds like it might be a bit of a timing attack there as well. But if you're able to do that, it can result in a use after free, which basically means that after that has, in theory, been freed up, you're able to go back in and either corrupt that data or leverage that data for further attacks. So sort of not good. The second one, which I thought was of this, these are both 2022 CDs for those playing along at home. But the second one is in WebGPU, which is intended to be replacing, I don't have my notes in front of me. Damn it. Well, we get the idea. It's intended to replace some of the existing graphics libraries within Firefox. But so in that particular case, if a unexpected message is sent across that framework, IPC message, that can once again result in a use after free, which can result in a sandbox escape. So, we've got these browsers which are going to more and more trouble to try and sandbox these things, and people are figuring out little ways to get out of that sandbox here and there. So yeah, they're of note. Good we're covering at the top of the hour. While you're listening to the rest of the show, you can restart your Firefox browser if it is not playing Application Security Weekly. And what do we got next, Mike?
Well, we got next. You definitely hit all the great, not buzzwords. Sounds like I'm being like I'm teasing, but all the good words there with the sandbox, IPC, etc. Because even especially the web GPU one, that stood out to me in the sense that IPC is kind of in the sandbox aspect is how a lot of, I think, the browser architectures have tried to shift to, so you could do the process isolation. So it definitely raised my eyebrows to see, an unexpected IPC message is the one that's getting into that use after free and active exploitation, because that's clearly, a security boundary that they're focusing on. So. That's an ouch. Maybe it's time for more Rust, and we'll get to a Rust discussion shortly. But I also threw in a couple of small vulns to go through. Now, none of these, I have to admit up front, are in software that's necessarily hugely pervasive or too exciting. But I thought the types of vulnerabilities and sort of the theme that comes out of them was a little bit interesting. So the first one to me was a integer overflow and table parsing extension within Markdown, essentially. And this is, for example, GitHub flavored Markdown specifically. So for all of you who are moving your blogs from WordPress, for example, to GitHub and using GitHub pages like me, this might be of interest to you. And what was neat is that here's someone who sat down and said, I wonder if I could have a Markdown table with columns. I wonder if I could have a Markdown table with about 2 to the 16 columns in it. And I'm pretty sure they didn't hold down the pipe character and for about half an hour to fill that out. That's possibly scripted, but it created a classic C language error, integer overflow. Overflow turns into potentially remotely exploitable vulnerability, just depending on how this Markdown parser, where it's deployed, how you can get into it. But I wanted to highlight it just because it's, once again, surprising to some pretty simple, straightforward text. Markdown still can produce problems within its parsers. And I also threw in a link to the fix. So when we talk about a lot of these types of vulns, we often say it's fixed or it's been fixed, but we actually don't walk through the fix so much itself as well to sort of explain, is this the approach you would have taken, for example? So if that's something, listeners, you would be interested in to sort of talk through the fix rather than the vuln, let us know, because we might have to prep for that a little bit and actually read some code. But that just was a thought that came to mind about different things we could do. And so, John, I don't know how much Markdown, don't know how much Markdown you've been doing lately, but I'm not sure if there's anything interesting on that one, or we can go and talk about the other Markdown problem that was in Hashnode.
I'm a longtime fan of Markdown, so and what I hadn't looked at this one too closely earlier because we were not doing a code walkthrough. But what I'm trying to figure out here is just I browsed this. So this is the C reference implementation of this.
Yes.
I'm wondering how long until someone realizes there's some issues on the JavaScript side of things as well, right? Because that's when we actually take, at least if you're in a browser, and I have to think about it. I guess even in a browser, the Markdown rendering is going, is it going to happen server side, or I bet there's a client side Markdown library, especially if you're editing. I'm actually not sure how it does. If you edit within GitHub, using that as an example, and you click preview, is that doing an API call, or is that just, I guess it's rendering it in the browser, but I could be wrong. Anyways, I'm wondering if we're going to see patches to other languages as a result of this.
Yeah, I'd be curious, especially. And one of the things I wanted to highlight too is that I looked into the repo for this, and they have a nice directory for testing. And in that nice directory for testing, they've got some fuzzing framework set up too. And it's not just an empty stub where it's like, we run a fuzzer, but the fuzzer is it has no semantic understanding of the of Markdown. It actually does, but even what the researcher here, what they pointed out is that there's a difference between semantic understanding of here's tables, there's some different, maybe some embedding, some ways you might put the parser into a different interesting state. But getting that 2 to the 16 characters in there is going to be a little bit different, and not all fuzzers aren't necessarily going to think of doing that. So I suppose that's an aspect of just basic testing. Think about those boundary edges, about integers and where you're using them. The second one. Oh, yeah.
Well, on that, there's always space to improve, right? So
yes.
The first time when we're writing this, we got the parser. Cool. It's used by tons of people. We all love Markdown. That's not just like, okay, pat yourself on the back and go throw that code in the corner. It's like, okay, how can, and this is, again, that balance between engineering versus business. But as you have time, or you're listening to ASW, or you're going for a walk or whatever else, like, how can I improve that? Like, I've got these fields. How could what happens if I put, 2 to 16 characters in there? It's like the fix I'm actually looking at now is actually relatively, the patch is sort of big, but I'm guessing the core is there's an if test on are you at uint 16 max? If you are, break out of the loop. So a lot of these type of things don't, frequently when we're originally writing this code, we're trying to get the code out, I say this all the time, but we don't put the effort into as many tests as maybe we should. But, it's pretty simple to go back in there at a later point and go, hey, I was thinking about that. Maybe you're working on something else in that function, and go, let me add a check in here as well, and see if we can make that a little more reliable.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a lack of creativity, especially on the developer side. I think, as you were pointing out, just the lack of time and the pressure to get things out. Like, we're pressured to cover the next article about Hashnode, which was, I thought, coincidental that I came across. It was also about Markdown, but this one, again, was not an integer overflow. This one did have my favorites, .. inside it. And also highlighted it because it's another example of just a really great blog write-up. And so it's a walkthrough of the researcher wasn't even in particular looking for exploits. They were actually migrating their blog from Jekyll, or Jekyll if you are Scottish, to Hashnode, and looking for that Jekyll to Hashnode import. They found something that looked kind of wonky, an error, and then they with their application security hat on, thought, what's up with this error? Let me dig into that, and then found some ways to do some path traversal to find some classic Etsy password, some SSH keys, and do some fun stuff. So the likelihood scenario, this is not necessarily a hugely pervasive type of application that I'm going to have to go back to a log4j style, but it was just a really neat write-up, really clever thinking, and I just wanted to highlight the counterpoint of, sure, here's our C-based parser, Markdown. C is bad, but we can also have plenty of other problems in in memory-safe languages for that matter as well. So, broad range of things to think about.
Yeah, and for those like me who had never heard of this before, Hashnode, reading their website, is quote unquote the hassle-free blogging platform for engineers, thought leaders, and the dev community. Imagine my side eye. So yeah, it's. I don't think beside my snark, I've got too much more to add here. I think it's good that you've paired these together so we get a sense from different points of view of how it's sort of like, I guess, almost like I was saying a little bit. It's once you, and I think it's something we see in the research community too, right? Once we see a classification or a category of attack or vulnerability, people start going, "Hey, I wonder if that exists over here." So we haven't tracked down all the path traversal bugs yet. So I'm sure there's a few more we can get out there.
I don't know. That sounds like you've spoken like a true thought leader there, John. Be careful. I did have one other article that was, again, a vuln, not necessarily in a really interesting software, but this vuln was a logic flaw. And it was literally just using an and condition rather than an or. And again, it's a blog.assetnote.io. You can go, all of these are as usual linked in the show notes. It's another nice write-up, but this one got me thinking as I was looking at the patch for the first Markdown flaw we were talking about, the C-based one. I was thinking about reading code, and I was looking at this. I was thinking again about reading code, and that aspect here, this if clause that I'll just read out loud is if string is null or empty text, that's your parameter into that, and dynamic web.content, blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of is null or empty, ands and ors. There's a lot of just thinking, wait, do I want this to be true, false? What happens here? And it's one of those aspects that it just kind of, here's a kind of my rhetorical question for listeners. Is there any research out there that you've come across or just even discussions you've had about if statements and the logic clauses inside them in terms of readability, and at what point do human brains get overloaded? Because we spend much more time, I forget the numbers, but 10 times, 20 times more effort reading code or time reading code than we do writing the code. And so if you get something like if true, then do something. That's the pathological easy case. But if you start to get a string of this and or this and not this, but yeah, and get really confusing. And of course, compilers are just going to do what we tell them to do. But the human brain gets pretty messed up, which everyone can tell as I try to stumble through all of our announcements every week. So I don't know if this, if you've come across this idea, even just from your own personal style when you're writing code, John.
I'll occasionally get them myself. I'll occasionally have obvious logic errors where somebody else will look at the code and go, that you need to either do or do not need a not on that. And it is, I think it's interesting the way you phrase that question to me, though. It's if you get in a pattern of using a style that works for you, preferably works with your dev team, at least your team, if not a company.
Right.
But if you have a style of, this is the way I usually write this, like one that's coming to mind to me right now, Deep Source, the code analyzer, it likes catching in my code. If I do a string, if I look for an empty string by checking length, so length string name is equal to 0, it'll flag it and say, no, you should probably do string name, variable name equal quote quote. So I'm not sure if, I suspect at the end of the day, the Go compiler is going to bring those both down to the same bytecode. I haven't checked in this case. I have looked in other cases. But yeah, it's if half of your code has that check one way, half of your code has that check another way, and that's a really simple example, right? That screws with your head. If you can, make this simple and clean and standardized and have like a standard pattern of doing it, it becomes easier to find when you do it in a different way. So yeah, I guess my own trick, if a logic string starts becoming too complex to make them parenthesizes and stuff, I would probably, it depends. I mean, I've had, if statements which are 2 or 3 lines long and they're sort of embarrassing to even admit to, right? But sometimes I'll break them down into like more than, either if I can put them into a function and have the function do the analytics and the function has a decent name on it. Excuse me, not the analytics, the logic. Or else do actually nested if statements. And it might not look quite as clean, but each one's easier to read. So you go, if this, then okay, and this, and then it's actually also sort of handy for debugging. If you're trying to figure out, which parts that are actually working or not, you can put a log statement in there a little bit easier. But it's one little character can bite you, especially on this stuff.
It can indeed. Oh, and a good pun there too. I did like the point you mentioned too about, most of the time the compiler is going to bring it down to the same bytecode. So I guess my only other thing that you also just jogged in my mind was, don't try to optimize in your code and outsmart the compiler. I think 11 times out of 10, the compiler is going to outsmart you. That 11th time might be that unfortunate surprise, but write it to be readable. And the optimization is going to come from your compiler, not from your own brain. At least fingers crossed for that.
Totally. Yep.
That does now, so we're going to shift out of just talking about vulns, because that's not the only thing that goes on with application security. Within application security, there are hundreds and hundreds, or for you Carl Sagan fans out there, billions and billions of applications. And many of them are NPM packages, many of them are non-NPM packages. And that's how the Census II of free and open source software broke out a few hundred applications that they took a look at. So this is an effort from the Linux Foundation and others. So it was Harvard Lab for Innovation Science and the Open Source Security Foundation, which the OSSF, we've talked with some of their people this last year, and we've been highlighting a whole bunch of work they've been doing. So it's great work. And they basically looked at, I think it was 8 groups of 500, the top 500 lists, and 4 groups of NPM, 4 groups of non-NPM. Just basically to point out, if we had to prioritize securing applications that everybody uses. So, for example, and I hate that I keep repeating this Log4j, but Log4j is a good example. Who has this? And if they say, how many people have Lodash? How many people are using React, or just a UUID NPM package, or jQuery, or the isArray, or inherits? These are just a couple that I was pulling out of the top 10, roughly, or top 16, I think, the isArray in NPM. And they're saying, they're positing, these are the most used, so probably we should be looking at how to fix them. Now, there's a couple different things that came to my mind as I was looking at this. One is just that isArray example, which I think is like a 1 or 2 line package, but is in the top 20. But it's also pretty much there to support older browsers. And how many people even need that package, or how much time is this package? How often is this package being pulled into applications that honestly don't even need it? And we're just increasing attack surface. Now, I'm not necessarily saying isArray is the one that's going to be the attack surface. That's the next type of easily exploitable remote code execution. Highly unlikely. I understand that. But I do like the principle that deleting code is a security effort, and getting rid of, not supporting Internet Explorer 10 or Firefox 12 is probably a good thing. So those are a couple things I was thinking of, just from, let's delete a bunch of these packages because we don't need them, or maybe we don't need to support a huge backlog of legacy software is where I'm going with that. So I don't know if that resonates with you, John, or if you were looking at these lists and still reading the list, possibly something else was coming to mind.
I'm going to need another 15, 20 minutes to read the list. I think, and we talked about this before with isArray a little bit, but I think, it's sort of what you're just describing is, it's a form and a way of refactoring, but you're not refactoring your code, you're refactoring the ecosystem, which is sort of a neat little brain experiment, thought experiment. What I was going to say there, I wonder... My first thought as you were talking through that is there's a percentage of this is based on education of the developer, from the point of view of what's the use case where someone goes looking to see if they need to use isArray. Their grasp on JavaScript or TypeScript probably isn't that great to understand how do you check for if something's an array in TypeScript. So they go and they get some third-party code to do it. So is it partially that we need to be teaching... God, I can't even believe I'm going to say this. Teaching better fundamentals, and the reason I'm eye rolling at myself is, like, it seems like most places that you'd go for a software development job nowadays, that interview is grilling you on the basics of CS, which I usually say are useless. So maybe the data structures and that type of thing aren't quite so important, and like, tell me about a time. But at the same time, do you know like some of the basics behind that? So maybe and that's maybe not so much something for a interview, but like just ongoing. Like, how do we? I'm not sure how to do it. Maybe is there something in NPM a little more like the Linux kernel, where if you try to submit a package, which I guess curation is where I'm going here, but if you try to submit a package which like the basic language supports this, you go, no, we're not doing that. Here's the link to go and do it. And maybe, I guess at the end of the day, looping back to where I was trying to start on this is, if there's parts of that language where, if there's something going on in that language where people are creating libraries for something which already exists, either is there improvement needed in the base language, or is there improvement needed in the documentation and education around that? So I guess that's sort of where I think about it from. I'm looking at it almost more from a marketing point of view. But yeah, I like the core idea that you had in there of as I said, refactoring the ecosystem, but I guess what do we need to make sure is in place so that refactor can happen?
Yeah, and I think that's possibly, we do have Dependabot, which is that, that GitHub capability to say, here's your pull request, just merge this. We've done all the work for you to update, to bump this semver to the latest package. I'm curious if there could be kind of a refactor bot. And you mentioned marketing, so I'm going to have to work on my naming for that. But there are, this is just a list of 500 packages, but there's something like on the order of thousands within NPM alone. And so you want to hopefully find some scalable way to have automated refactoring that's also, unfortunately, not going to completely break everything as well. So I'm just kind of curious if there's something there. Mm-hmm. One other thought I had just on this list on the non-NPM side of things, it was a lot of Maven, aka Java, some NuGet, some C# was in there, and lots of Go and Python, but there was no mention of Rust. And I was just kind of curious, is that just a mind share? Is that just an observation bias? Is it more of the Google hegemony, if you will, that Google got into Go and everybody wants to do what Google does, and so that's why Go was adopted, but Rust hasn't quite made inroads into this type of census. So kind of curious. I don't think I have anything deeper on that comment, though.
Well, a little, and I'm not saying this is a pure thing, but a little bit of that bias in there comes from Linux Foundation and CNCF are funded by the big G. So that probably has a little bit to do with what packages is Google open sourcing and contributing to the community, what languages are they written in, and then how is the ecosystem built around that might be part of it. Just a guess.
Maybe just a guess. We have now. We've got we'll be wrapping up the news real quick here, but one final article I did want to throw in here was John. This is where I have to maybe put all my caveats out there. In the past I've linked to a handful of cryptocurrency articles, and this is the first time I've linked to a VC article, and I don't know how I feel about that, but here's a VC who was talking about building for the 99% developers, and I thought the message here was really good, both on the sense of just building for DevOps, but also building for security, because honestly, speaking of Google as an example, we also talk about Netflix and Facebook and AWS, those big FANG companies, if you will. Lots of small companies don't have the same scale of security, and they don't need the same type, and they also don't have the same amount of, hundreds of security engineers being able to do a lot of the capabilities or deploy the tools that we might be talking about week to week. So I think it's a good reminder that when we talk about application security, we shouldn't only ever be referencing this is what the Facebook does, this is what Google does, and they have very specific problems that, for the most part, lots and lots of other companies aren't going to have. So we need to make sure that we are talking about AppSec for everyone, for that matter.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't even realize this was an Andreessen article. So for those not in our little bubble, and I live outside the bubble nowadays, but Andreessen Horowitz, I don't know, probably top 5 venture capitalists in the world. What they like to do is, they have done an amazing job on the marketing side. I think they actually have they've created their own media group, and I think this might be part of that. So what they do is they bring in co-founders from some of their portfolio companies, in other words, startups, which are part of that they've invested in, and have them do guest posts like this. to sort of make everyone get a little more attention. I like the way she's written this. Sort of going through all these different categories, talking about what the myth is and what reality is, talking about like gold standard for development environments. If we're going for perfection, if we're going for trickle down tooling, I really love that name. So yeah, it's just because this is on a VC's website, there's a lot of good stuff on Andreessen's website, Andreessen Horowitz. So yeah, I think we could dig in this a little bit deeper, but maybe she might be interesting to find and have her come on the podcast in the future, Jean, if you're out there. So I'll leave it at that.
No, absolutely. And I think that's going to be a great setup for us to talk to someone who's actually, like you, John, had spent a lot of time in startups and security startups. So with that, I want to say thank you, John, for a whirlwind of news. Thanks for everybody who's listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with our interview of the week.